welcome to Michigan Football at the Voice of College Football. I am one of the post-game hosts, Desmond. Before we get started, would like to encourage you to please like and subscribe the video, share it out on social media. It helps the channel grow, which we are trying our hardest to be the #1 team channel at the Voice of College Football network or family. Also, subscribe to Mark's main channel, The Voice of College Football. I believe he is 34,000 strong and looking to grow and get more. And also subscribe to Mark's Discord as well. So thanks for joining us. Mark will be joining us in a little bit here, as well as Steve Helwick, which if you tuned in last week, you got a glimpse of Steve. He joined our channel and he's going to be with us today. So excited to have him tune in as well. So just dropped a chat just saying thanks for tuning in, and also let us know where you're tuning in from. It is quite the rainy day here in Michigan, where I am located. But we have had a string of some really nice days, which I am not complaining about at all. Actually, just got a text from my partner, Dre, said on Friday it's supposed to be in the 90s, which the way our spring, if you want to call it, has been, I'm not complaining at all. So, yeah, we got some nice weather going on. When Steve joins us, we're going to talk a little bit about Hawaii. Steve is a college football writer, and he covers all teams. And so he's going to kind of give us some info on Hawaii. They are the second game on Michigan's schedule. They play September 10th. It's I took a quick look at their schedule. They were 6-7 last year. Looks like they have a couple guys coming in that are from kind of JUCO transfers. A couple guys transferred from other universities. I think they had a quarterback from Washington State, if I'm not mistaken. So potentially, we'll see. It could be a different team than what we would typically see with Hawaii. It's got to be a very difficult thing to play a Hawaii schedule, just because every single week that you're not playing a home game is a lot of travel. And you're talking about, potentially playing at, I mean, I didn't even do the math, but 6 or 7 a.m. potentially, what the time that you're used to. So I have no idea. The game time for that Michigan game is to be determined, but I'd be hard pressed to think that that's going to be a night game. So you're talking a 12 o'clock, maybe a 3 o'clock kick if you're trying to be a little cognizant of Hawaii making that trip. But even a 3 o'clock kick is got to be a very, very early a day for Hawaii. But we will see what happens. And we'll be here after that game. So feel free to tune in with us. Also, like I said, please like and subscribe. And what I wanted to cover until we have Mark and Steve join us was out of conference schedules. So this was something that came up a couple weeks ago, and we were just talking about, is Michigan's out of conference schedule, is it something that's tough enough to test them as a team when you're trying to get to that next level, that elite status? To me, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to schedule. I mean, I do like to see the, Oklahoma, Texas, the Georgia, Clemson. I like to see those games, Oregon, Ohio State. I do, and I think most of college football fans do like to see it. But someone had made a comment just saying that they felt like a lot of the SEC teams schedule cupcakes and things like that. So it made me want to go back to just a couple years, well, quite a few years, but to the 2012 season, which is when actually Alabama and Michigan scheduled each other, and just compare the two teams of how they have scheduled their out of conference schedules. And granted, before I kind of dive into it, number one, I was actually surprised at how difficult Michigan's actually was. Just off the top of my head, my assumption was most years it's not great, but I think they have done a really good job of scheduling tough opponents. Now, part of those years, I think 3 of the years that I looked at was the Notre Dame rivalry and that, kind of schedule that they had on a pretty much annual basis. They had 2013, 2014, and 2018. But there's also a couple years that I looked at with Alabama that they had some pretty tough teams as well. But it made me think that Michigan has some years where a year like this year where you're playing Colorado State, you're playing Hawaii, just not overly difficult teams, and in the environment that we're in now with college football, you you if we take just this snapshot, we know what the prerequisite is if you even want to hope of the college football playoff, and it's one win, or I'm sorry, one loss. Once you get two, you're out. So one loss is where you really want to be. And I think if you're in a conference like the Big Ten, it's a very difficult conference. It's a very strong conference, top to bottom, and there's not many teams that get through it unscathed. They just don't. I mean, you look at even the team that has won it pretty consistently in Ohio State. I mean, they have won it with a conference loss. So it is something that you have to be cognizant of. Now, as things progress with the expansion of the college football playoff, which is inevitable, I think it's going to open up the possibility of teams scheduling harder out of conference teams, because you're going to want to do whatever you can to boost your resume. It's not going to be just a one loss team. Whether you win your conference or not, you have a really good shot. It's going to be very different. It's going, I think, and I would hope that the committee or whatever the system is to that has the college football playoff, whatever that system is, I would like to think and I would hope that they would look at a team that has two losses but has scheduled some top tier teams and maybe took a loss but still had a really good season, and putting that team in over a team that has a cupcake style schedule and is undefeated. That's ideal. But as someone who has watched college football, I'm not quite sure that will be the case. But I think regardless, a team like Michigan that has the brand, that has just the name recognition, I think Michigan will be in a really good shape. But it'll be important to continue to schedule those teams. But yeah, so rolled through a couple of the years. So obviously in 2012, Michigan scheduled Alabama that year. The next 2 years for out of conference, and I basically just grabbed the best team that I thought in the out of conference. The next 2 years in 2013 and 14 were both Notre Dame. In 2015, which I believe was Jim Harbaugh's first year, they scheduled Utah, which Utah's been a pretty consistent team, really good program. Also, the year after that, they had Colorado, which that was a bit of I won't say that was a tough year. After Colorado, you had Florida in the 2017 season. 2018, you had Notre Dame. 2019 was Army. And I know it's Army, but what I will also say is Army was pretty tough that year. And Michigan actually shut them down. That was just a couple years ago. But Michigan did a really good job. And that was, if I'm not mistaken, the Don Brown was there, and that was a very unique style of defense Michigan played. 'Cause I think they played 3 down linemen and 3 safeties, which is very unique for the triple option attack that you see from a lot of the armed forces teams with Army, Navy, and Air Force. But Michigan did a terrific job in that game and played really well defensively and overall. You had 2020, which was conference only COVID year. 2021 was Washington. Colorado State is probably their best team that they're going to play this year in the out of conference. Next year, you have, I picked East Carolina, so that'll be for 2023. But 2024 and 2025, Michigan has Texas and Oklahoma in the out of conference schedule. So you're talking about some pretty good teams coming up in the next couple years, and I believe by that time, those teams will technically be in the SEC. So I think Michigan has done a good job of scheduling in the out of conference. So that'll be it'll be interesting to see how that scheduling continues for 2026 and beyond. So perfect. So we've got Steve Helwick joining us, and let me get Steve on in here. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing excellent. Good to be here again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's good to have you, man. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, so how's your Wednesday? How's the hump day going for you?
It's going pretty well. I'm really excited for Warriors and Mavericks tonight. Is what's on the radar for this Wednesday night. I'm a big basketball fan, just like college football, so that's what's on the radar right now. But also looking forward to college football season. A lot of news drops today with dropping divisions in the Pac-12 championship. So a lot of changes are on the radar right now.
Well, I know you are a college football writer, so I'll just kind of kick it to you and tell us about the news.
Oh, well, the Pac-12 just announced that they're no longer having divisions for the conference championship game. It looks like other conferences are going to follow suit. Now, that's a big one for the Pac-12. Anyone who remembers the early 2010s, mid 2010s for Pac-12 knows that that championship game would have been Oregon versus Stanford nearly every single season. But instead, both of those teams represented the Pac-12 North, and they would be fed like an 8-5 UCLA or Arizona State team. So that made our Pac 12 championships a lot less intriguing at the early turn of the decade. I remember in 2011, there was a 6-8 UCLA team that represented the Pac 12 South due to USC being on probation for a year. That UCLA team went 5-4 in the division, 6-8 overall. So the AAC already made this move when they dropped UConn and went to 11 teams, and we're seeing better championship games there. We got Cincinnati Houston last year and Cincinnati Tulsa the year before instead of the best division winners there. And knowing how the Big Ten, how dominant the Big Ten East has been over the Big Ten West, that could be a big one for the Big Ten because has the Big Ten West won it under the current format?
I
Was
don't believe so. Mark
not in the
would
college
be a
football
bet.
playoff era.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't think they have. Nope, because it would be essentially what Northwestern or Wisconsin.
yeah, or
It's
Iowa,
basically been Ohio State. You had
Michigan, Michigan
Michigan
State, and
State
Penn
once.
State.
Yep. So yeah, the
Yeah, the
West
Big Ten
hasn't won
West
it at
has
all.
zero division titles ever since they moved on from leaders legends. I remember Wisconsin just kicking the snot out of Nebraska back when it was leaders legends. I think Ohio State and Penn State were on probation that year, and that allowed Wisconsin to sneak in there. And I think they went to the Rose Bowl at like 8-6 that season. So I wonder if the Big Ten would follow suit with the Pac-12 with the divisions. So that would definitely be an interesting development they could have there. You could get more Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State, Michigan State in your division as division instead of division champions. That could be your Big Ten conference title game. So I think it's a good move for the Pac-12, who's really struggled to send teams to the college football playoff. They haven't had a champion with less than 3 losses since 2016 Washington Huskies. So I think it's a good move for their division to put the two top teams in that conference championship.
Yeah, I wonder with that. I'm another person who thinks that it would be a good move for the Big Ten, and not that they struggle to have any representation in the college football playoff or national championship, but I just think it's a better product overall, and I think you probably have a better shot of getting two teams in. But I think the difficult part is what if you, for instance, have a Ohio State Michigan game like we had this past fall, where you have a pretty dominant win, and those are the two teams that essentially have to suit up the very next week. Now, I believe it's happened before with Texas and Oklahoma, but I'm not quite sure. But I would wonder how people would accept that, and viewership, things like that, the things that matter kind of at the big scale, how that would impact that conference championship.
Yeah, you've seen some teams where the regular season result changes from the last year. Oklahoma State, I don't think they would have made the playoff if they won because Cincinnati secured that fourth spot undefeated record. Oklahoma State beat Baylor in a game which seemed pretty convincing in the regular season. I think it was a 10-point game. And then they play again in the Big 12 championship game, and that result ultimately costs Oklahoma State any shot at a college football playoff appearance. So it could be a double-edged sword. It could help the team get a resume-boosting win, because if Michigan beat Ohio State again in the championship last year instead of Iowa, that's definitely a more resume boosting win that they would have had. So it's a double-edged sword, and it could go both ways. I don't think it would impact the Big Ten very much, because the Big Ten champion pretty much every year, save for, well, Ohio State did miss it in 17 and 18, I think, but Penn State missed it in 2016. Usually the Big Ten champion does get into the college football playoff, so I don't think it affects that conference as much.
Correct. We've got Mark Rogers joining us. Mark, how we doing?
Gentlemen, doing well.
Good to see you. We were just talking about the news. Steve had let us know the Pac-12 is getting rid of divisions, and we kind of hit on this a little bit last week, but just we were talking about the impact for the Big Ten, and would the Big Ten also follow suit, which, you know, to kind of piggyback off last week, we were talking with the just essentially having your two best teams, your best potential product in the conference championship, but then also with the expansion of the college football playoff, which is inevitable, you know, just potentially having more possible teams getting in. I think it probably is a move that I think they should do. I don't know what they will do, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not surprised that the Pac-12 led the way, which I haven't, or probably almost no one has made that statement about the Pac-12 for a long time. But concerning this, that the Pac-12 led the way, because I think their new commissioner, George Kliavkoff, I believe that he appears to be a very forward-thinking guy, a guy that recognizes the place that the Pac-12 is in, being disregarded, considered the worst conference, just knowing that he's going to need to make some bold moves to get it going. And considering he has an entertainment background, he very much wants to, you know, pull any move that he can to showcase the Pac-12 in its best light. And, you know, I think, like you just said, Des, that all the conferences will eventually, it appears, go to this format. And so I think he just wanted to be the guy and the conference to get out in front of that. And also, I would think that considering the projected two best teams in the conference could be in the same division, that they're looking to maybe help out USC a bit.
Well, I look at it the way that, and maybe it's a little bit of a unique situation, but you know, with the Big Ten, they changed their, you know, standards, and granted it was the COVID year, so I guess you could really say all bets are off. But I think it was a stipulation that, you know, that you had to play an X amount of games, and Ohio State had a cancellation, and, you know, it was a mess. But, you know, for the Big Ten, it made sense for them to make an amendment or change, whatever you want to call it, to have your best team get into your conference championship, because you're looking at the playoff and things like that, those types of ramifications. I think it's obviously a little bit different because USC is probably the biggest brand, but I don't think we can say right now they're the best team. That obviously remains to be seen. But, you know, I don't know. I think it's overall a really good move. Like, you know, Steve was saying that they haven't had I think less than a 3-loss champion since the 2016 Washington team. You know, so it's really, I think if you're a Power 5 conference that's struggling to have representation in the playoff, you need to look at potential moves that will help you even in the interim before the expansion of the playoffs to try to get there. Because I could imagine that's probably a heck of a moneymaker to get to have one of your teams playing in the college football playoff.
I'll say this just because I know somebody's going to comment on this. I believe Oregon was 11-2 in 2019, but to Steve's point, yeah, multiple losses that have obviously put the Pac-12 in a position of not the combination of the champion not having one loss and also losing the big non-conference games for the most part even though Oregon was able to pull off an upset last year, has really taken the Pac-12 off the table for a while.
Yeah, definitely, and it'll be interesting to see. I know USC has very high expectations. I believe odds just came out for potentially the best odds to win the conference, and I think USC had better odds than Utah, who I believe won it last year. Uh, so that's interesting, and if I'm not mistaken, Utah returns a decent amount of their talent, so that's very interesting. I think people are betting big on Lincoln Riley. Caleb Williams. I know they had a lot of guys from the transfer portal, so I'd imagine that's what's fueling that, and just excitement overall. I mean, I would imagine if before the 2015 season, a lot of people probably would have bet on Michigan, winning the conference just because of the excitement of Jim Harbaugh getting to campus and his track record of what he's done.
Absolutely. And did you guys talk about the Big Ten at all in regards to what this could or could not do for the conference?
We touched on it a little bit, but you can go ahead and elaborate.
Well, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago in regards to the balance of power in the Big Ten is pretty obvious. Ohio State's been the best program, and then the other best programs have been in the East. If you look at the totality of the two divisions, there's not much difference. Like if you total up all the games, I've gone through this process, and I think there was only a 1-game difference between top to bottom in the divisions in regards to wins between the two divisions and total conference wins. And it's been pretty close the last few years. But the best teams always win. So there's not a concern about the 5th, 6th, and 7th place teams. Maryland's been awful in the past, pretty good last year, but awful in the past. Indiana was awful this past year. And, of course, Rutgers top to bottom since they joined the conference. But the balance of the Western Division doesn't help it at the top. And, of course, they've lost each Big Ten championship game. So, I don't know how people will respond to an Ohio State-Michigan rematch if we're going to see that. Let's say we see it 4 times in 10 years. If we see it too many times, I know the purists are going to hate it. I think I will tend to like the novelty of it the first time, that there was a game the week before, there had to be a rematch the next week. But then if it happens repeatedly, I think it takes away from the game, the one time that they play each year. So that could be difficult. And to move that game off the last weekend of the season, I don't know that the Big Ten would make that move.
Yeah, I'm interested to get both of your takes on this. So let's say, example, both Michigan and Ohio State are undefeated going into the game. And let's say just with the game and conference championship, they split. They each go 1-for-1. How do you both think that plays for when you talk about playoff, right? Because a lot of people, when you look at just this past season with the conference championship of Alabama, Georgia, well, no one wanted to see them play again in the first. Well, they didn't play again in the first round, but then played again in the national championship. So that kind of comes into play a little bit as well. How do you see it? Would we rather see them play, almost a third straight game, or do you split them essentially and put them on different quote unquote ends of the bracket so they could potentially, the third time be in the national championship? So I'm not quite sure. Steve, what do you think if they split, right? So let's say Michigan wins the game, Ohio State wins the conference championship, let's say it's clear they are 2 of the best 4 teams. How do you think that would kind of play out when it comes to the seeding for the college football playoff?
Well, I thought last year that the priority was splitting up Alabama and Georgia after that SEC championship game, where it didn't really matter where you seeded Michigan and Cincinnati as long as you were giving one of them Michigan and the other one Cincinnati. So and both of those teams proved that they belonged in that national championship game, and they won those games in convincing fashion. So I think that it would be preferred to split them up rather than, I guess, objectively rank 1 through 4 just for the betterment of the playoff and betterment of the product, I would say. So, and also a lot of times there's not a far distance between a 2 and 3 or a 3 and 4. So some of those rankings can be interchangeable a lot of times. So I think if in the rare scenario where that would happen, I would split them up. But another thing to factor in, I doubt this would ever happen with Michigan, Ohio State, given the tradition of the game and all of that. But the Big 12, when they implemented their conference championship game in 2017, one of the first things they did, they took Bedlam off the final week of the season because Bedlam in the mid 2010s was basically a de facto Big 12 championship game every single year. So they didn't want Bedlam repeating itself on the following week. Although they finally moved it back to the final week last season after Oklahoma State struggled to qualify for the Big 12 championship game. And that was almost our Big 12 championship game last year again, too. So they experimented with moving Bedlam away so we won't get it into back-to-back weeks so often. I don't think the Big 10 would do that with Michigan and Ohio State, but if they did scrap divisions, it would be interesting to see how often we would get the same game in back-to-back weeks, because that's not ideal to have that occur.
Yep. Mark, what do you think would happen in that situation, or what are your thoughts on it?
So we're looking at a three-peat. We're looking at 3 matchups
in one season. So not the Alabama Clemson of, part 2 and 3. We're talking one football season.
Yeah, so right now in the SEC with Georgia and Alabama only playing once every 6 years or 7 years, the likelihood of that happening is minuscule. But if the SEC goes in this direction with the balance of power being what it is in college football, with those two being at the top of the line, my goodness, they're going to be looking at even a greater likelihood of that happening, depending on how they set up these pods. So I guess not. You've got Ohio State and Michigan playing every year. You would think Alabama and Michigan are good, or Alabama and Georgia are going to be split up. But yeah, you threw out the scenario, Des, of undefeated Ohio State and Michigan teams going into the game. So you're looking at 13-1, or you're looking at an undefeated winner. They go on to win the Big Ten championship, and a 1-loss loser that's still considered one of the best teams in the country, and they're both in the playoff. Yeah. I would think that the powers that be are working through each season in the past to say, okay, we came up with this structure, this model. Let's run it through 2019, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, and see what we get. Even though the schedules are going to be slightly different, still the best teams are going to win the games. But to run that through and see how that would play out. Now, Michigan hasn't been nearly as good. They've been good, but not nearly as good as they were this past season. So that Ohio State-Michigan situation, I don't think would have come up too much. But if Michigan continues to trend up, then I think it's an issue. I think it's something that needs to be thought through.
What do you think so coming from an Ohio State perspective, what would you think, like Steve kind of mentioned, what would you think of potentially moving the game off of the kind of the cornerstone week that it's on right now? What would be your thoughts on that?
I've been watching this game since 1977. I'm dating myself. Sorry. Yeah, that hurts to say, but you guys can't even relate to 1977. But man, I just can't imagine Ohio State and Michigan not playing the last, like it being mid-October, they play, and then they continue on with the season on their merry way. It's just, man, it's inbred in me that that's the culmination of the season.
I would imagine. I'm curious to see what our listeners think about that. Let us know what you would think if if they moved the game from the, what is that, Saturday after Thanksgiving, it basically always is rivalry weekend. Steve, what would be your thoughts on that if they did? Like you said, I mean, the blueprint is there, right? So the Big 12 did that with one of their matchups. Now, I guess some would argue that Oklahoma Texas would be potentially a bigger rivalry than Oklahoma State, but nonetheless still a pretty big rivalry that they moved with the change of the getting rid of division. So if this were to come down, do you think that would be potential to move the game?
Real quick before Steve goes, just want to finish my thought because this just popped into my head. When they went to the Legends and Leaders, so the Big Ten was obviously just one conference, one standing. Then they added the championship game in 2011. They split into the Legends and Leaders. Well, they determined that they didn't mind separating Ohio State and Michigan in separate divisions, still playing the final game of the season and risking playing a rematch the next week. So it didn't last long. That concept only lasted for 3 seasons before they said, okay, people don't understand this. We're getting made fun of. Let's just go with East and West. Who in the world knows what we're talking about? Legends and Leaders. And there was all this crisscross geography that was like, why are they there? Wisconsin's and Ohio State, and they're all over the place. Nobody understood it. And so they only went with that for 3 years. But at the outset, they certainly put that together knowing, okay, we're going to have Ohio State and Michigan continue their series last weekend of the season. Then they could rematch in the championship game.
Perfect. Steve, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say where I would prefer Michigan Ohio State as a noon game on rivalry weekend every single year. But
there you go.
We know that almost nothing is that sacred anymore in college football. Early 2010s. Okay, I've been to a backyard brawl before. That might have been the most underrated rivalry in college football. It was just a staple of rivalry week. Pitt and West Virginia, those fan bases hate each other like to a magnitude that you won't understand. They just scrapped it. Texas A&M. I'm a Texas alum. My brother went to Texas A&M. I know that rivalry so well. That is bigger than any Texas rivalry currently, and that's bigger than any Texas A&M rivalry currently. We don't even know if they're ever going to play again. So anything can happen with a rivalry is just losing that esteem. It's
Absolutely.
Not going
We've
to
seen
Ohio
that.
State, but moving the game wouldn't be
Yeah.
the end all for that.
Yeah. They're certainly going to keep the game. It was the highest rated game in college football last year.
Yeah.
And typically, even when they're not that good, it's one of the 2 or 3 highest. It's just the gap between that game's ratings, and I know there were special circumstances with Michigan's surge, but it had like a 40% larger audience than the second highest rated game of the season. So yeah, they're going to protect it. But to Steve's point, that's been the one game that there's obviously a push typically to move the best games to night before this big noon kickoff initiative by Fox. The general thinking was, okay, these 2 teams are better than expected. They're 7-0, 7-0, or somebody's jumped up. We're going to move this game to nighttime. But that's one game that they've preserved at noon with one exception. 2006, they played at 3:30. And they were both undefeated in 1 and 2 in the country, and that's one of the reasons they moved it to 3:30. But I think they quickly determined it doesn't matter when they play. People are going to watch anyway. So we might as well keep tradition. And there was a lot of backlash to messing with tradition. So,
yeah, I mean, I like the noon kick. I like it as far as that day. I like the noon kick. But I took a quick look at the top rated or the most watched football games last year. And this is from 247sports.com. Obviously, the game was number 1 based on this article I just looked at real quick. Audience was 15.9 million. The next highest game was the Iron Bowl, Alabama-Auburn, was 10.4 million. So that, I mean, that is a lot that's a huge difference. I mean, that's essentially what 50% more. I mean that's huge. That's huge. And then Michigan had the third highest game with Michigan State, 9.3 million. So yeah, I like keeping the game where it is and have the powers that be figure out what the you kind of cross that bridge when you get there. I mean, I would think it probably wouldn't happen, like you mentioned, Mark, 4 out of 10 years, but I'm not sure if Michigan continues the surge that they're currently on, that we've seen in the past 12 months, and Ohio State keeps on their standard. Maybe we are cruising for that for the foreseeable future. But the thing that I look at is Michigan, as far as their out of conference scheduling, having tougher teams on the docket. I think that potentially could change it. I haven't looked up, Ohio State, but I know they played obviously Oregon here recently, Utah, or not Utah, Texas. So, maybe it's one of those things that as these teams start to put heavier and heavier teams on the schedule, that maybe that's a lot less likely that we really think that will be.
Although it's a conference only determination of who those 1 and 2 seeds are. So regardless of their out of conference performance.
Yeah. But in that so
you're talking about the playoff, going
right.
to the playoff.
Yeah. So
Gotcha.
so essentially having that three-peat.
Okay.
Now you still might get a back-to-back, which I think I feel like people can live with. It's just another shot at watching the rivalry game. Both of those fan bases travel really well, so Indianapolis would be just maize in scarlet, and I think it'd be awesome.
The fan base that's going to be annoyed in any given year is the one that didn't need to win that game to get to the Big Ten championship game, and they're like, "Oh, we got to beat them again," versus the team that is just, okay, we have to win this game to get to the Big Ten championship game, so we will gladly have to play them again, because otherwise, if we lose, we're out.
Yeah, wouldn't that be weird if Ohio State and Michigan be like the first conference game, be like in week 3 or something, like end of September? It just would be odd. I don't know. I'd be good with that. I'm not quite sure. Not sure. I feel like it would take away a little bit, because you have the banter that goes by all season. When both teams were to beat Michigan State, well, we beat them by 20, you only beat them by 10, so we're better. You'll see at the end of so it would take away from that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I don't think that I think with the Big Ten and their history, I think they'd be hard pressed to move that game.
And one of the favorite catchphrases of odds makers is a letdown game. Now, you talk about the ultimate letdown game. If Michigan would have beaten Ohio State like in week 10 and still had somebody else to play the next week like they did last year, they slay the giant and they still have to play Maryland the next week.
Iowa, road game at Iowa.
Yes. Yeah, give them something like that. Yeah, something tricky. Yeah, go to Wisconsin the next week. Exactly.
Oh, perfect. So, let's kind of switch gears. We were wanted to, obviously Steve's been hanging out and been having a great time with them, but wanted to kind of dive in a little bit to Hawaii. So I took a quick look to see. It looks like they have a couple guys coming in, kind of some upperclassmen. I think they had a quarterback coming in, and they had a tight end who had some pretty good career stats. I think Hubbard might have been his name, but can you kind of run us through kind of what Hawaii, what their 2021 outlook was, and then kind of just roll into their, off-season recruiting and kind of talk about their hopes for this upcoming season?
I'm not going to lie, there are not many programs in college football that are probably had a worse offseason than Hawaii. Hawaii had the Todd Graham situation go on, where there was a hearing in the Hawaii State Senate about his alleged mistreatment of players in the program, and they had all these hearings released and all of that, and it ended up with a mutual dismissal of Todd Graham, and they hired their former quarterback, local legend Timmy Chang, and he's going to be the head coach now of Hawaii. So that should stir some excitement. But this Senate hearing came right after a mass exodus of transfers from the program. And Hawaii lost almost all of its key contributors from last year, from its quarterback, Siobhan Cordero, who's now going to be San Jose State's quarterback, all their best defenders. Their cornerback, Cameron Lockridge, went to Fresno State. Darius Muasau, their star linebacker, went to UCLA. Jordan Laulu went to Oklahoma on the defensive line. Hawaii just had so many guys last year. Nick Mardner, one of their best receivers, went to Cincinnati. Just a mass exodus of transfers where the team's so inexperienced at this point. They didn't bring that many in, that this is going to be a team that I do not think has high or lofty expectations for 2022. This is a complete rebuilding year for Hawaii. They're probably not going to win more than 3 games, and I think you'll see a lot of struggles this year. Last year's Hawaii team, they had a pretty good passing offense. They also were a little benefits of a weak schedule. They had 6 wins. 3 of them were an FCS team, and they got to play New Mexico State twice. So they got to pad 2 wins there. And the offense really came around at the end of the season, and they won their last 2 regular season games. But their Hawaii Bowl against Memphis was canceled due to a COVID outbreak in the Hawaii locker room. So we never got to see how Hawaii would have done in that bowl game. So Hawaii in 2021 was a solid team. They had a lot of defensive issues, which were magnified in week 0 against UCLA and persisted throughout the year. They were even evident in that 50-45 win over Colorado State on rivalry weekend. But when Hawaii lost so many of its talented defenders, and just last year alone, there was Corey Bethley, their star safety, who has transferred. He had 5 interceptions, one of the top in the nation. Darius Muasau, who I mentioned earlier, had 5 forced fumbles, which was also top 10 in the country. He was a team leader in sacks, tackles for loss, just dominated from all areas as a pass rusher. Cortez Davis, a member of the secondary that they're losing this year, I think he went to the NFL. So Hawaii is just a completely different defense this year. And offensively, they're going to have to pick up the pieces and build around Braden Shager. Shager was a quarterback who led that monumental, surprising win over Fresno State last year, where Jake Haener just threw a ton of interceptions, and Hawaii came out victorious due to the turnover margin. And then and then their other key returners, I think, Dedrick Parson was their second leading rusher last year. And one of their receivers, Zion Bowens, he had a 93-yard reception and one of those late season wins I remember. So they don't have that many pieces from last year to build around, and this team, it's going to be a struggle for them.
Steve, I love statistical oddities. Anytime there's some kind of strange statistic or number that doesn't make sense or is way out of the norm, I kind of latch onto it. So I was looking up Hawaii's schedule just now because I had recalled their bowl situation last year. Well, they still went 6-7. They played one more game than everybody else. They must enjoy playing football in Hawaii, because last year they played a 6-7 season. So they played 13 games without a conference championship game. Then wasn't it a couple years ago, they played 15 games. They went 10-5 a couple years ago, Steve, I remember.
In 2019, they were in the Mountain West Championship game against Boise State. So, they went 10-5. They
played 14 regular season games.
Hawaii plays an extra game every year to make up for travel revenue.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yes.
They tacked on another one a couple of years ago. I just think it's funny. They went 10-5 a few years ago.
Yeah, they played the full college football playoff schedule. I remember that. That was a controversial Christmas Eve win over BYU. I think it was due to a fumble call near the goal line, and they beat that Zach Wilson BYU team with Cole McDonald in the Hawaii Bowl. But yeah, that Hawaii team was pretty good, went 10-5. Good offense. I loved watching Cole McDonald play at Hawaii. He really revived that program after they had a pretty substandard mid-2010s.
Now, I think this is also kind of strange, but I don't know what else they would do to reward Hawaii players for making postseason play. But every time they make a bowl game, practically, they stay at home and play in their home stadium for a bowl game. So this is, you can go year after year after year after year, and this is Hawaii's plight. They stay at home and play in a bowl game. It seems kind of like everybody else is looking to go somewhere to play in a bowl game. They play in their home stadium, but then again, they're in Hawaii. Do they really need to go anywhere else?
Yeah, that's also for travel costs. In the pandemic
Sure.
season, they played in the New Mexico Bowl, which occurred that year in Frisco, Texas. So that was
You were there,
since,
weren't you?
no, I was not.
You didn't go
But
to that one?
since Colt Brennan led the team to the Sugar Bowl in 2007, every single bowl game they played, except for the pandemic season, was in the Hawaii Bowl. So they're pretty much a lock for that bowl game if they qualify for eligibility, and that's usually one of the first bids that are announced too.
That's got to be such a difficult travel just arrangement to like before you guys had hopped on, I was talking about, the Michigan Hawaii game in week 2, and my thought was like, well, like I know that's not going to be a night game, so let's say it's a 3 o'clock kick. I mean, I didn't do the math on it, but that's got to be what, 10 a.m. probably earlier for Hawaii. Like that's just it's tough. Number one, with the travel, you're just going. I mean, I would call it cross country, even though they're not in the like continental U.S. But they're flying cross country, and then on top of it, you're playing most times just at such an early time than what your body is used to and what these guys are probably typically practicing at.
I think it was a noon game when they played in 2016 at the Big House. Michigan won 63-3. Just ridiculous box score I'm looking at right now. Chris Evans basically just went off for a huge gain every time he touched the ball. The quarterbacks combined 17 of 20, Wilton Spate, Shane Morris, and John O'Korn.
They weren't awake yet.
Yeah. Michigan just absolutely decimated Hawaii in 2016 when they last played.
Ugh, yeah, that's just difficult. It's a tough deal, and and then also, how do you manage that? Like some teams, if you're gonna have a late game, like an 8 p.m. game, sometimes coaches will change the practice time. So instead of practicing from 4 to 6 every week like we usually do, we'll practice 8 to 10 p.m. right, to get our bodies used to it that week. You can't just say we're gonna practice from 10 to 12. I mean, some guys have class. Like it's just a weird dynamic to have to work around with Hawaii. It's so weird.
It's a 6-hour difference.
Jeez.
So they're playing at 6 a.m. in the morning for them.
Ugh,
Travel is such an underrated part of sports. Does travel? Draymond Green was talking about it with that Warriors Grizzlies series, that he has to play a game, hop on a 4.5 hour flight, and then you play like the very next day, and that can be a lot of very exhausting in like that 7 game series. So we're seeing the same thing with Hawaii. They have to do this like every week of the regular season if they alternate home and road games. So it's crazy. I mean, the program's at such a disadvantage, which makes you really appreciate that 2007 team even more, the one that qualified for the Sugar Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, because in basketball and NBA, I mean, you just think in your mind, well, it's the Western Conference, so yeah, it'll be there. It's a quick flight. It's like no. Memphis, Tennessee to San Francisco is not a quick flight. Now, Boston, Philly, that's something totally different. And we got who's in the East, Boston and Miami. I mean, even that that's a decent amount of travel. I mean, you're not, switching time zones, but nonetheless, that's still a pretty decent, flight that you have to take after 8 p.m. game. So you end at what, midnight, 1 o'clock? You got to shower, fly. So that gets just magnified when you're, flying from Hawaii to Michigan. That just, I couldn't. And then, what if stuff gets lost? I just, in my mind, I think of so many logistics that could just mess this whole thing up and just make the travel even worse. Yeah, I don't envy those guys, but yes, kudos to that 2007 team. Colt Brennan was lighting it up. And Timmy Chang did too for his, for not for nothing. He threw for a ton of yards. They were in the, gosh, who was that air raid coach that, June Jones.
June Jones.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So is he the USFL or XFL. I think he's around somewhere. He's still kicking and still throwing it everywhere.
Is he? Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Atlanta Falcons.
Ooh, okay.
At one
That's how
point.
Timmy Chang got his coaching career started, was a grad assistant at SMU when June Jones was there.
Nice. Perfect. Okay.
I remember when June Jones was playing. So
I didn't even know
calling
June Jones
myself out, I
played
know.
football.
Yeah, he was a quarterback for the Falcons.
Okay.
Before he was a coach for the Falcons, head coach for the Falcons.
Oh, that is interesting. I'll roll through a couple questions here. So, random fun fact, but last chance use own Dior Scott. Now I saw he's on the roster. Is he still? Looks like he's still there at Hawaii. He was at Laney College in California, I think, and then went over to Hawaii. So I thought that was cool. I watched Last Chance U. I liked it more with football. I don't know why. Maybe just I don't know. Maybe because I'm a bigger football fan than basketball, but it was pretty good. Did either one of you guys get a chance to check out any of those Last Chance U's?
I have not seen it.
Sorry, Des. I thought maybe Steve could pick you up on that one.
No.
That is okay. That is okay.
Certainly heard a lot about it. Maybe I should check it out.
Yeah, it's you've gotta go into it with an open mind of knowing what you're getting ready to see. I think it sheds some light on the JUCO kind of experience. It's very different than what you would ideally think of when you're talking about like a Power 5 team, like thing. The first couple seasons was like a nicer JUCO. Like it was a place where they had 6 and 7 different jersey combinations, like really nice stuff. Well, as they started going to different JUCOs, you could see a different side of it where they didn't have that kind of stuff, and it was interesting. The last season they did football. It was a JUCO that didn't have any dorms, so you had guys that had to figure out their own like housing and things like that, and it wasn't a great situation for most of those guys. So they really had to kind of grind it out to try to get to that next level. And unfortunately, you see guys who are just who mess up the controllables, like the things that you can control with your attitude, your effort, being where you're supposed to be at the time you're supposed to be there, things like that, where it's just like, oh man, but it was interesting though. It was interesting as a guy who could not play that level of football. It was kind of cool to see some of those guys. Yeah. So, yeah, I was gonna say, do you guys have anything else you want to cover? We got a couple minutes to spare. I'm all out of stuff today.
Steve, give us this one, and if I blindside you on this one and you got to get back to us later, let me know. But
Okay.
Is there a program in the group of 5 that you think might surprise?
Ooh.
Well, this might be a surprise for some of you. I mean, they're going to be preseason ranked, but I think Houston Cougars are going 12-0. If you look at Houston's schedule, I mean, any team can lose on any given day. You're always going to have that Purdue upset or whatever that happens to you. But Houston Cougar schedule is so favorable this year, and they avoid UCF and Cincinnati in conference play.
Really?
Yep.
In non-conference,
Okay.
they get UTSA, who loses a ton of talent from last year, Kansas, Texas Tech, and Rice. So I think they should probably sweep that with their veteran team coming back. The one that went 12-2, beat Auburn last year. I think the Houston Cougars are going undefeated. As far as other surprise teams,
But that schedule's not going to help them with a playoff bid a la Cincinnati.
I mean, for Cincinnati last year, to even make the 4 seed, they had to go undefeated. They had to have Notre Dame finish the regular season at number 5. They had to have down seasons from 3 conferences. It was ridiculous. The amount of hoops they had to jump through just to secure the 4 seed last year. So that wasn't really hey, I told you so. The group of 5 can make the college football playoff after all. No, it was pretty much every single thing working out in Cincinnati's favor just to get in.
If Notre Dame goes 11-1 and loses, let's say, to Clemson, I know they didn't play Clemson, but they're playing them this year, and they don't play Cincinnati, well, they're getting in over Cincinnati.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's amazing how ironic that is, that a game that was scheduled 9 years ago factored into the, it's not like Cincinnati signing that contract in 2012 thinking, yeah, we need this Notre Dame game so we can get into the playoff.
That doesn't even exist at that point, right? They're signing some in 2012 saying, yeah. I'm sure this imaginary, bracket is going to happen, and we're going to need this game. It is so interesting and unique that just how many things had to line up perfectly, and it almost got to a point in the college football season, like later on, where you almost forgot who Notre Dame lost to. It was just, hey, Notre Dame is 8-1, and they're doing good things, and they're kind of forecasting it out. They could have a shot, and for myself at least, I kept forgetting, like, oh, Cincinnati beat Notre Dame. Like that's their one loss, and they won every other game, but they just lost to Cincinnati, and it just in Cincinnati, even though they went undefeated, they had a couple of those games, like I think they're second and third from last games, where like you guys are blowing it. You guys are absolutely blowing. I thought after that game, I didn't think they were gonna. I was very concerned. Very concerned.
What were those games,
goal line stands to beat Tulsa.
Yeah, it was Tulsa. The Tulsa game was the big one. There was like a fumble inside the tent. There was a goal line stand, right, in that game. Or
they stopped them on like 4th and goal, and then they fumbled the ball like when running right before victory formation, and then they had to come up with another goal line stand. So yeah, but that's how legitimate their defense was, and everything Cincinnati did was really proven how good the team was. Just a few weeks ago at the NFL draft, only Georgia and LSU had more draft picks than that Bearcats team. It was an all-around good team. They're going to take a huge step back this year with their lack of experience and losing so many keys on defense. Another reason I like Houston in the AAC this year, but Luke Fickell definitely had a juggernaut of a team last year, and they struck lightning at the right time.
Yeah, they did have a few miscues or narrow escapes, I should call them. The Tulane game, the Navy games, they had a few other close calls. The Indiana game was close till about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm glad that they did get a group of 5 team in there, and not that they that just because it's a group of 5, like someone they quote unquote deserve it, but I think it's good for them to get a shot. I mean, and when you look at it, that 4 seed didn't perform any worse than most of the other 4 seeds that get in. So, I know people are, some people may have been upset about it and, they, their schedule and whatnot, but like, I mean, really for most seasons, they performed pretty much the same as most of the 4 seeds do.
Yeah, they did.
Cincinnati's also not a group of 5 team, because this is a team that in the 2009 season, if you remember that Texas-Nebraska Big 12 championship game, if Texas does not get an extra second to kick that game-winning field goal, that team is playing Alabama in the BCS national championship game in 2009. So Cincinnati's been there before. Now, a team like FAU or UTSA, now those teams the odds are way stacked against those teams compared to your Cincinnati's and UCFs, like the teams going to the Big 12. That's a completely different ball game, is those teams. So Cincinnati has a lot of considerable advantages over those teams, and Cincinnati's more similar to more teams in the Power 5 in terms of recruiting, tradition, budget, all of that, than they are to teams like North Texas or Louisiana Monroe or teams like that.
True. Mark, anything in closing?
No, I think we are all set. We'll be doing a Florida State show within seconds. So if anybody else wants more college football conversation, we've got Florida State talk. We're going to preview the LSU game, and then Miami at 7 Eastern.
Perfect. Well, Steve, thanks for joining us. I've got his Twitter handle down below, so feel free to give him a follow. And I've got to shout it out. I mean, you're verified. You are a big deal. You've got the blue check on Twitter. So, I mean, I had to say that. I was sending Steve a DM earlier today, and I was like, oh wow, Steve's a big deal. So
Nah, I just applied and it went through. My editor told me to do that, so yeah.
Hey man, it works. It works. Oh man, appreciate it, Steve. Thanks for joining us. Mark, thank you as well. And folks, appreciate you guys tuning in with us. And please like and subscribe. We appreciate it. See you guys.